The Tupolev Tu-4 was a piston-engined Soviet strategic bomber that served the Soviet Air Force from the late 1940s to mid-1960s. It was a reverse-engineered copy of the American-made Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Design and development. Toward the end of World War II, the Soviet Union saw the need for a strategic bombing capability similar to that of the United States Army Air Forces. The Soviet VVS Air Arm had the locally designed Tupolev Tu-4 engined heavy in service at the start of the war, but only 93 had been built by the end of the war and the type had become obsolete. The U.S. regularly conducted bombing raids on Japan, from distant Pacific forward bases using B-29 Superfortresses. Joseph Stalin ordered the development of a comparable bomber. The U.S. twice refused to supply the Soviet Union with B-29s under Lend-Lease. However, on 4 occasions during 1944, individual B-29s made emergency landings in Soviet territory and one crashed after the crew bailed out. In accordance with the Soviet-Euro-Japanese Neutrality Pact, the Soviets were neutral in the Pacific War and the bombers were therefore interned and kept by the Soviets. Despite Soviet neutrality, America demanded the return of the bombers, but the Soviets refused. 3 repairable B-29s were flown to Moscow and delivered to the Tupolev Tu-4. One B-29 was dismantled, the second was used for flight tests and training, and the third one was left as a standard for cross-reference. The aircraft included one Boeing Wichita 5BW, 2 Boeing Wichita 15BWs and the wreckage of one Boeing Renton A1B and 3 different models from 2 different production lines. Only one of the 4 had de-icing boots as used on the Tu-4. With the Soviet declaration of war against Japan in accordance with the Yalta Agreement to enter the war within 90 days of VE Day at about 11 p.m. on August 8, 1945 2 days after the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima and the subsequent entente with Japan ending, the 4th B-29 was returned to the U.S. along with its crew. Stalin told Tupolev to clone the Superfortress in as short a time as possible instead of continuing with his own comparable Ant-64. The reverse engineering effort involved 900 factories and research institutes, who finished the design work during the first year. 105,000 drawings were made. By the end of the second year, the Soviet industry was to produce 20 copies of the aircraft ready for state acceptance trials. The Soviet Union used the metric system, thus sheet aluminum in thicknesses matching the B-29's imperial measurements were unavailable. The corresponding metric gauge metal was of different thicknesses. Alloys and other materials new to the Soviet Union had to be brought into production. Extensive re-engineering had to take place to compensate for the differences, and Soviet official strength margins had to be decreased to avoid further redesign. Yet despite these challenges the prototype Tu-4 only weighed about 340 kilograms more than the B-29, a difference of less than 1%. The engineers and suppliers of components were under pressure from Tupolev, Stalin, and the government to create an exact clone of the original B-29 to facilitate production, and Tupolev had to overcome substantial resistance in favor of using equipment that was not only already in production but in some cases better than the American version. Each component made and each alteration was scrutinized and was subject to a lengthy bureaucratic process. Differences were limited to the engines, the defensive weapons, the radio and the identification friend or foe system, the American IFF being unsuitable. The Soviet engine, the Shvtsov Ash-73, was a development of the Wright R-1820 but was not otherwise related to the B-29's Wright R-3350. The Ash-73 also powered some of Aeroflot's remaining obsolescent Tupolev Tu-8 airframes, an earlier Soviet 4-engined heavy bomber whose production was curtailed by higher priority programs. The B-29's remote control gun turrets were redesigned to accommodate the harder-hitting and longer-ranged Soviet Neumann NS-23 23mm cannon. Kerber, Tupolev's deputy at the time, recalled in his memoirs that engineers needed authorization from a high-ranking general to use Soviet-made parachutes. Additional changes were made as a result of problems encountered during testing, related to engine and propeller failures, and equipment changes were made throughout the aircraft's service life. The Tu-4 first flew on May 19, 1947, piloted by test pilot Nikolai Rybko. Serial production started immediately, and the type entered large-scale service in 1949. Entry into service of the Tu-4 threw the USAF into a panic, since the Tu-4 possessed sufficient range to attack Chicago or Los Angeles on a one-way mission, and this may have informed the maneuvers and air combat practice conducted by U.S. and British Air Forces in 1948 involving fleets of B-29s. Some attempts to develop mid-air refueling systems were made to extend the bomber's range, but these were fitted to only a few aircraft. First public appearance. The aircraft was first displayed during a flyover at the Aviation Day Parade on August 3, 1947 at the Chisinau Airport in Moscow. 3 aircraft flew overhead. It was assumed that these were merely the 3 B-29 bombers that were known to have been diverted to the USSR during World War II. Minutes later a 4th aircraft appeared. Western analysts realized that the Soviets must have reverse-engineered the B-29. The appearance of an obviously Superfortress derived to 70 transport over the crowd removed any doubt about the success of the reverse engineering. Operational history: 847 Tu-4s had been built when production ended in the Soviet Union in 1952, some going to China during the later 1950s. Many experimental variants were built and the valuable experience launched the Soviet strategic bomber program. Tu-4s were withdrawn in the 1960s, being replaced by more advanced aircraft including the Tupolev Tu-16 jet bomber and the Tupolev Tu-95 turboprop bomber. By the beginning of the 1960s, the only Tu-4s still operated by the Soviets were used for transport or airborne laboratory purposes. A Tu-4A was the first Soviet aircraft to drop a nuclear weapon, the RDS-1. Variants: Tu-4, main production version, originally designated before, Tu-4 variants without special designations, Tu-4 ELINT and ECM, Tu-4 mothership for DFS 346. Tu-4 escort fighter mothership, Tu-4 remotely controlled target drone converted from time-expired bombers. Tu-4 fuel carrier, Tu-4 in-flight refueling test beds, Tu-4 radiation reconnaissance aircraft, Tu-4 communications relay aircraft, Tu-4A, nuclear-capable bomber used to test Soviet Rhodes-1 RDS-3 and RDS-5 nuclear bombs. The standard Tu-4 was not capable of carrying these weapons. Tu-4D, troop transport. Tu-4 KKS, anti-shipping version, armed with KS-1 Comet missiles carried between the engines under the wings. Tu-4LL, engine test bed for the Mikulin AM-3 jet engine, the Evchenko AI-20, KSTs of NK4 and KSTs of 2TV2F turboprop engines, the Dobrynin VD-3K radial engine and AV-28 contra-rotating propellers. Tu-4 nanometers, drone launcher aircraft with Lavochkin La-17 unmanned aerial vehicles carried underwing. Tu-4R, long-range reconnaissance. Tu-4T, paratroop transport, Tu-4TRZHK, liquid oxygen tanker aircraft. Tu-4 USHS, navigational trainer. Sha-1, testbed for Myasishkov M4 to develop a bicycle-type landing gear. UR-1/-2, testbed for Myasishkov M4 powered controls. Tu-4 AWACS, Chinese prototype with KJ-1 AEWC, AWACS radar and powered by Evchenko AI-20K turboprop engines. Tu converted to allow the Chinese to monitor U.S. nuclear weapons tests in the Pacific. Tu-70, airliner derivative, never reached mass production. Tu-75, cargo aircraft derivative, never reached mass production. Tu-79, Tu-4 with M49TK engines. Tu-80, bomber derivative, never reached mass production. Tu-85, bomber derivative, never reached mass production. Tu-94, Tu-4 with turboprop engines. Operators, Soviet Union, Soviet Air Force. The Soviet Air Force operated 847 Tupolev Tu-4 bombers between 1948 and early 1960. They were initially used as long-range bombers. In 1954 the Soviets began phasing out the Tu-4. Units upgraded to Tupolev Tu-16 bombers and, beginning in 1956, to Tupolev Tu-95 bombers. Tu-4s withdrawn from frontline units were used for transport duties. People's Republic of China, People's Liberation Army Air Force. On February 28, 1953, Joseph Stalin gave China 10 Tu-4 heavy bombers. These Tu-4s were refitted with AI-20K turboprop engines in 1966. The last PLAAF Tu-4 were retired in 1988. In 1967, China attempted to develop its first airborne early warning aircraft, based on the Tu-4 airframe. The project was named KJ-1 and mounted a Type 843 rotordome on top of the aircraft. However, the radar and equipment was too heavy, and the KJ-1 did not meet PLAAF's requirements. The project was cancelled in 1971. The single prototype aircraft is now on display at the PLAAF Museum north of Beijing. Survivors: Tu-4 4114, XKJ-1 AEWC, 4114, stored at Tangshan, China. Tu-4 4134, 4134, stored at Tangshan, China. Tu-4 unknown, 01, stored at the Central Air Force Museum, Munino, Russia. Specifications: data from Tupolev Tu-4 Soviet Superfortress, general characteristics, crew, 11, length, 30.179 meters, wingspan, 43.047 m, height, 8.46 m, wing area, 161.7 m2, aspect ratio, 11.5, empty weight, 36,850 kilograms, gross weight, 47,850 kilograms, max takeoff weight, 55,600 kilograms euro 63,600 kilograms, power plant, 4A, Schwarzenbach 73 TK 18-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engines. 1,790 kilowatts each, propellers, 4-bladed V3A3 or V3BA5, 5.06 m diameter, performance, maximum speed, 558 km per hour at 10,250 m, range, 5,400 km at 3,000 m with 63,600 kg takeoff weight including 3,000 kg of bombs and 10% fuel reserves, service ceiling, 11,200 m, rate of climb, 4.6 meters per second at 1,000 m, time to altitude, 5,000 m in 18.2 minutes, wing loading, 400 kg per meter 2, power mass, 0.11 kilowatts per kilogram, armament, guns, tenor, 23 mm Nudelman Surin of NS-23 aircraft cannon, 2 cannon in each of the 4 turrets and 2 cannon in the tail barbette, missiles, 2A, KS-1 Comet standoff missiles, bombs, 6A, 1,000 kg bombs, or 1X RDS-1, RDS-3 or RDS-5 nuclear fission bomb. See also, related development, Boeing B-29 Superfortress, Tupolev Tu-70, Tupolev Tu-75, Tupolev Tu-80, Tupolev Tu-85, aircraft of comparable role, configuration and era, Avro Lincoln, Consolidated B-32 Dominator, Messerschmitt Me-264, related lists, list of bomber aircraft, list of military aircraft of the Soviet Union and the CIS. References. Notes Bibliography External links, to 4 photos at airliners.net, including PLAAF examples. To 4 bull entry at the FAIS.org website.